everyone. My name is Sabine Amir, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this third workshop in the series of workshops titled Delineating the Digital. Before we move on to our workshop session, a quick overview into how and why delineating the digital. So it was back in 2020 and 2021, just like everyone else, I found myself stuck within the four walls of my university en suite. It was also the time that I had to start working on my master's dissertation. So being an architect and urban planner, I'm so used to going on sites, conducting field surveys, talking to people. But at that time, I had no option but to conduct a desk-based research. However, towards the end of my dissertation work, I got really interested in expanding my understanding of the digital methodologies. And this is how the idea for delineating the digital, was born. So I would just share my screen. Words of our workshop facilitators, Dr. Tiffany and Dr. Leigh, talking about this workshop, which we have titled as Digital Storytelling for Public Archaeology. In recent years, advances in digital communication platforms have revolutionized how we can tell stories about the past to the public. So this workshop will address how we share data-driven narratives of our research with diverse public audience. Participants in this workshop will think critically about the role of public scholarship in our discipline and begin to develop a plan for their own public-facing projects. The event is scheduled, so we'll have this joint workshop session by Dr. Tiffany, who is an associate professor of digital history at the University of Central Florida, and Dr. Leigh, who is a digital project specialist in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. This will be followed by a Q&A session, sort of a discussion session. So if throughout this workshop you have any questions, just feel free to pop into our chat box. Moving on to our network. So we are a group of PhD and master's students who are working in the direction of academic and scientific knowledge dissemination in the fields of archaeology, ethnography, linguistics, and other art-related fields. Introducing our amazing workshop facilitators, Dr. Tiffany, she, as I have already mentioned, she's an associate professor of digital history at the University of Central Florida. She is a specialist in the archaeology of the ancient Near East and spatial analysis. Her field projects include the Kurd Qabristan project in Iraqi Kurdistan and the Veyotzer Fortress Landscapes project in Armenia. Her research practices include public and community archaeology. She received her PhD from the Johns Hopkins University in 2016. Moving on to our second workshop facilitator, Dr. Leigh. She is a Roman archaeologist, material culture specialist, and open data enthusiast. She serves as the digital project specialist in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University and the director of strategic partnerships for the Alexandria Archive Institute. For more information, feel free to visit their websites. The floor is all yours, dear facilitators. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for inviting us today. You can see the link to the slides there. Hopefully that link works. If it doesn't, let me know in the chat and I'll fix that after the presentation. But if you'd like to follow along with the slides, that could potentially be useful, or even save them for later, because there's a lot of embedded links in the slides that you might find useful for pursuing topics after the workshop today. The real meat of this presentation was developed by Tiffany and myself, really through my affiliation with Open Context and the Alexandria Archive Institute and the American Society of Overseas Research on Tiffany's end. So a lot of the branding you'll see throughout here is open context related, but we really have tried to tailor it for this specific audience and thinking through some of the bigger themes that you all are trying to address through this workshop series. And we're really delighted to have been asked to join this, this exciting lineup. So Tiffany, you already heard Tiffany's intro. Again, some links there that can tell you more about her. I should also say Tiffany is here, but we decided that because Tiffany is in the middle of a hurricane zone in Florida right now, her internet is not as stable as mine. So I'm going to give the presentation for both of us. But again, this wouldn't have been possible without the hard work that she put into this as well. And if Tiffany, like I said before, if there's anything you'd like to chime in about, just feel free to unmute yourself and have a go. Tiffany is very much a specialist that works in the Caucasus. My expertise is elsewhere in the Mediterranean, primarily in Italy. So I'm really going to rely on you all to think through how some of the examples of digital projects that we'll look at today can be translated or adapted for the places and the themes that you all work on. We're also both coming at this from an American context. We're both coming at this from the context of archaeology. And I know that this network that you all have built up contains scholars from a myriad range of disciplines. So hopefully you'll find something that you can stick on to there. So again, just my background slide, but Sabine did such a good job. So I won't get into that, but some links if you'd like to pursue those. I did want to just give you a little bit of a roadmap for today. So we'll start off by talking about data stories and just kind of what is storytelling in the disciplines that we're thinking of. We'll then kind of branch out and think a little more big picture about whether or not stories even count as a form of scholarship. And then most of our time, I think, we'll spend thinking through how did they make that? And we'll think through some digital platforms. We'll look at some examples. And again, we'll have an opportunity to kind of get a little creative about what we might be thinking of doing with our own research. So let's start off then with data stories. One of the questions that can guide us from the very beginning is, what is archaeology? So on the one hand, there are so many questions that can be answered using scientific methodologies like carbon dating, using high-tech equipment like total stations and drones. But on the other hand, you look at a picture like this and you see the bulk that has been excavated back, and it tells this kind of visual narrative, right, of processes, deposition processes, and work processes that went into it, really in chronological order. So for archaeologists, that bulk, it's a story begging to be told and begging for interpretation. And if we had to define archaeology, we'd probably have difficulty giving it a single label, right? A lot of us will consider ourselves interdisciplinary for a reason. And that's another thing that I find so exciting about the network that you have all developed, the Caucasus Through Time. It's the fact that you're really modeling interdisciplinarity so well by bringing scholars together from a variety of different backgrounds who are all focused in one way or another on the same region, the same general topic. So whatever box we want to put archaeology into, whether we think of it more scientifically, whether we think of it as a humanistic discipline or somewhere in between, stories are what enable us to translate the data that we all collect for diverse audiences. And some of that will have a strong background in the content of the scholarship that we're producing, but some of that may not. So archaeologists really have the potential to look at a whole range of disciplines to find tools to tell these stories. We're used to looking at art history, we're used to looking at history, we're used to looking at anthropology. But what if we tried to inform our practice with maybe some less obvious connections, like creative writing and like film? What if we started to embrace some new humanistic frontiers and we began to craft narratives exclusively for public audiences using the kinds of computational methods or techniques that have been developed by digital humanists over the past few decades? What if we started to get a little creative? And you might be wondering, well, what does that creativity even look like? So for example, in recent years, the field of spatial history has emerged really kind of as a branch of digital humanities. And spatial history is the study of the past that attempts to understand the situation of events in space rather than chronological order. So visualizations, both static and animated, have really become the hallmark of this type of scholarship. And here you can see my colleague's wonderful article. And if you do look at the slide deck, you can actually click through on the image and get to that link. So that's just one example of these embedded links. Another good example, I think, could come from performative storytelling or live storytelling. So this kind of practice began as really an autobiographical grassroots type of activism. Stories about something small or something personal were marshaled to speak to larger problems or issues in society. And these kinds of really more theatrical initiatives are popping up all over, right, in local arts communities, but also on college and university campuses in the last few years. What's at stake in all of this? You know, especially in these kind of really heated political times that we're in, you know, we're on the precipice of culture wars. We're seeing, you know, debates about the longevity and the status of statues in our landscape. We're hearing about the Black Lives Matter movement. We're constantly fighting with pseudo archaeologists and this idea that aliens built monuments on social media, right? This is really, in a certain sense, a battle royale for the soul of the public, right? And can we craft products that are going to be as catchy as what the History Channel is putting out there, and some of the other things that you see accessible to diverse audiences? We also have to think through the intentional destruction of cultural heritage. That's a worldwide problem in the Caucasus and the Middle East in particular. You know, these tragedies that we hear about on the news are a lot closer for us that actually work in these regions, right? And we know those communities that these have affected so tragically. So there is a lot at stake when we think through all this and we think through why we want to do this in the first place. But when it comes down to it, I think this quote from Flannery O'Connell kind of highlights really well what one of the problems is for us as scholars. You know, Flannery O'Connor said, I find that most people know what a story is until they sit down to write one, right? So you can recognize it, but how do we actually turn the work that we're doing into something that is engaging, something that attracts an audience in the same way as some other forms of popular media? As academics, we're probably very comfortable with a certain type of writing, especially a certain type of presentation strategy. So when it comes to translating our scholarship into stories, there are two kind of go-to strategies that I embrace in the work that I'm doing. The first is one that we're not really going to talk so much about today, but Tiffany and I have done a lot of work in this area. And this is really grounding your story in the data. And this comes out of some of the work that Tiffany and I have been exploring over the past year, but also some of the underlying work that informs our practice at Open Context, just in cultivating data literacy and really prioritizing data in what we're doing. But the second kind of thing that I anchor myself to is finding good models that can inspire you. And actually, I shouldn't have said good models, finding models that can inspire you, right? Because if you have this kind of vocabulary around what a good digital storytelling project is, or even what a bad digital storytelling project is, that's going to inform your own practice. That's definitely going to influence what you want to do and what you're inspired to take on for your own work. So that's really going to be what forms the bulk of our time today. We'll focus on looking at models and kind of how we might assess those and what we might think about. So that was kind of a little background introduction about data stories. But now I want to get a little lofty for a second and think a little more explicitly about why this matters and stories as scholarship. So we'll think about whether or not these types of projects that we're working on are considered serious scholarship ? And that'll lead us into a discussion of especially what universities and colleges count as work. And yet, so even though there may be some institutional hurdles in front of us to really find a place for this kind of work we're interested in doing, we'll end on a positive note, and we'll think about why it's still a good idea to really cultivate skills around digital technologies and around digital storytelling more generally, for the directions that we're going. So I actually want to start this with a discussion with a story. And this goes back to two articles that were published a couple years ago now in the Chronicle of Higher Education. So you can see from the titles of these pieces that this is going to be an exercise in contrasts, right? So that article on the right, which again, if you look at the slides, you can click through and access these. In that article on the right, Whitaker's premise is, and I want to quote here, "Too many early career scholars seem to be investing their time and energy writing a lot for the wrong kinds of publications. And by wrong, I mean venues that won't lead to tenure." So Whitaker then goes through and kind of methodologically discusses where late stage graduate students and early minted PhDs should be focusing their efforts. And she creates this kind of roadmap for early career scholars around publishing. So in response to Whitaker's piece, Bond and Gannon, less than a month later, highlight one of the most significant oversights in Whitaker's work. And they comment that her advice certainly applies to faculty at major research universities or elite liberal arts colleges, but it really doesn't apply to all scholars because most of us aren't going to end up at those institutions. And I quote them here. "For too long, academia treated such work as lesser than, not prestigious enough to count for real college scholarly work. And make no mistake, it is scholarly. And this resonates far more widely and deeply than much of the traditional, and in large part, literally inaccessible projects prized by a more limited view of legitimate scholarly activity." So you think of the interesting article that you see retweeted or shared on Facebook, and then you click through and you have no institutional access, so you can't actually get there, right? Here, I think Bond and Gannon and Whitaker are really talking more or less about public scholarship. And for me, public scholarship is just one of many types of academic work that we, meaning those of us in higher education more generally, don't really know how to properly assess. So this list to me includes subject areas like digital humanities or the scholarship of teaching and learning, or even publishing your data, right? These are things that if you know, asked to kind of define what they are and whether or not they'll count for tenure and promotion, people tend to be a little fuzzy with those details. And this isn't just a problem in archaeology, right? This idea that we need to get better about communicating our findings to diverse publics. So especially more recently, and Sabine, I think you mentioned that the whole concept for this network really developed out of these pandemic years, right? Where we all felt isolated and we all kind of wanted to come together and find these networks. You see some really good models coming out of science communication in particular. So here I show just two, a network, Skype a Scientist, that's pretty active, at least in the United States. And then one of my favorite podcasts, Ologies, that all focus on kind of thinking through really complex scientific things, right? Scientific topics, and translating them for audiences that might come into the field with no background information and no knowledge, but just genuine interest and a desire to learn. So the questions that I think kind of inform a lot of what we're thinking about this, and again, in reference to what you said before, Sabine, you know, one of the things that we can maybe talk about during the discussion, but I'll encourage you to think about, is how has your access to digital scholarship changed since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? I think a lot of us may be accessing more digitally, but what do we think about that, right? And what has that access been like? Is it facilitated by our institutions? Is it more difficult? Is it coming in forms that are taking advantage of the digital media, or is it just kind of a PDF that you can't even click on and isn't really robust in that sense? And then also, has your attitude about digital scholarship changed since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic? So what do you even consider scholarship anymore? I know for me, this was one of the first times that I've started to assign really videos and podcasts for my students was in the last 4 years. And part of that initiative on my end was just, I think we're all sick of reading, right? We're tired of staring at screens and nobody has printers at home or access to books. So why can't we spice it up a bit? So I think attitudes about digital scholarship and sort of reflecting where we are with that is really interesting. And then if we get back to this question of tenure and promotion, right? So in a little bit of research that I've done, it's hard to get a clear picture of the role that digital humanities or public scholarship or innovative pedagogy, it's hard to get an understanding of where these actually play in to what universities and colleges care about. So on the top, I borrowed the wording from a large public university, and on the bottom, I borrowed the wording from a small liberal arts college. But those are the categories, the buckets of things that are considered during tenure and promotion hearings. So where is this topic that we're talking about actually fit, right? Is it public service? Is it considered creative work? Is it a form of teaching? How can we actually frame this in a way that matters to those institutional bodies that are responsible for our employment in the long run? But if this intentional ambiguity from our institutions of higher learning about this kind of work seems frustrating, then I think there's actually quite a lot of encouragement if we look outside of our ivory towers. And this is where we get to the and yet portion of this section, because there's a ton of nonprofit organizations that promote and prioritize this kind of innovative scholarly work. And here I put just a couple from, again, American contexts, but I'm sure if most of you are in Britain, you can think of parallels that are useful for your own environment. These ones in particular might seem a bit adjacent to the work that we're doing, studying the past, and the work that Tiffany and I are doing in particular with archaeology. But there are also a decent number of prizes that reward public work and digital work across the professional societies that we may be a little more familiar with. So recognition for this work is kind of there. And the funding is definitely there for it, right? So if you look for small scale grants or large scale grants to fund these robust digital projects to really communicate your work with broader audiences, you can find it. And I think people are starting to understand this and are starting to come up with projects based on these calls for funding. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. Ultimately, I think one of the biggest takeaways from this that kind of underlines this whole conversation is the fact that many of us are likely going to find ourselves outside academia or academic adjacent after we finish our degrees. And more to the point, even if we stay in academia, many of the students that we are working with are not looking for careers in academia, right? So the more we can arm them with some easily transferable skills, the more they can leave our classrooms knowing about the value of writing for a public audience or creating something that is digital that is engaging, right? The more we can have them not just writing papers that are going to sit on my hard drive and never see the light of day after I grade them, the more they will go out into the workforce really valuing the background from their humanities education in a way that I think we need to make explicit. I think we have a responsibility to start making that explicit. So the other thing that, again, maybe we want to talk about this during the conversation later, but where does your ideal career path lead, right? I got the impression that a lot of the members of this network are graduate students, early career, late career. You guys are trying to figure out where you want to go and are trying to assess this landscape to see where you best fit in too. So does your path end with a tenure track position somewhere? And I know that sort of status is a little different in the UK and other places where you may want to work, but a permanent faculty position in higher ed. Or do you want to go into something a little more public facing yourself? Do you want to go into museums? Do you want to be an educational technologist to kind of support the development of the kinds of projects we're going to be talking about? Do you not know? Are you trying to keep all your options open, right? I think there's a lot of room to sort of think through these things. And while you sit on that, let's turn to, again, what I hope is going to be the most inspiring part of this presentation. And this is where, if you haven't looked at the slides yet, this is where there's going to be a lot of embedded links, a lot of things to kind of take home and explore later. This whole section, how did they make that? This is really inspired for me by a wonderful blog by Miriam Posner, a digital humanist at UCLA. And her original blog is pretty old at this point, but it sets up a good model for introducing students to digital scholarship tools and methods. Essentially, you know, she will take a project and dissect it, right? Talk about the audience, talk about the tools, talk about the technical know-how. And I think that that's just a really good practice for us to get used to as we try to get inspired. So we'll think a little bit about context and the framing of our digital projects, and then we will really run through some tools and platforms with some case studies thrown in there as well. And yes, why don't I pause for a second and type the link in the chat? Sorry about that. Stories. Okay, I hope that works. If not, someone else is going to have to do it. Excellent. So the framing of your digital stories, ultimately, it all boils down to this catch-all word, context, right? But I like to think of context as being made up of a few different things. Context to me is made up of goals and format and audience. So when we talk about audience, what do we mean when we're trying to think through what's important for a public-facing digital storytelling project? When we talk about audience, really we're thinking through the age of the people that we want to be targeting with this material. We want to think through the familiarity. Do they know a lot about this topic? Are they total newbies who are just learning about this for the first time? Oftentimes when you get the question of audience, you know, it's for a general audience. It's for, you know, a general population. There's no such thing as a general audience, right? Even if you're working on a digital project, your premise there is that people are going to be able to access this through a personal device or through the internet or through some digital means, right? And that necessitates a certain type of status. There are certain people that don't have access to those resources. So there's always a way to define your audience, and an audience is really going to factor into the other decisions that you make regarding your project. Same with the format. So when it comes to the format of your digital project, there are going to be tools that you already know how to use that are pretty simple to pick up. There are also going to be tools that are more difficult to pick up, right? So the learning curve involved with any sort of technical application is something that you're going to want to think through. What is the longevity of this project? Is it something that you want to stay around forever? Or is it something that is just going to be up for, you know, a year, a 2-year period, a short period of time? Because longevity is going to influence a lot of things, but especially your financial investment, right? How are you funding the back end of this project? How are you funding the hours that you are putting into this? Or if you're going to create a team that is composed of students, how are they getting paid for their work in this endeavor? So all of those questions can influence the type of platform that you pick to do this sort of work. And then finally, the ultimate goals. You know, do you want to build a community? Do you want to do are you thinking about pedagogical strategies, right? Are you trying to use this project to teach students something new or some technical skills? Do you want to get funding, right? That's not a bad goal to have. Do you just want fame and glory, right? Do you just want something that you have built associated with your name and out there for public consumption? Those are all good goals to have, but all of these kind of inform one another, right? And they all kind of come under this umbrella of what I think of as context. They're all interconnected. So making a decision about your audience will influence the goals or will influence the format. I also really like the idea that a project can be multi-phase, right? So if you have a project where you do want to target a variety of different audiences, can you stage it so that your first phase is for one audience and it has a particular format, and your next phase is another audience with a different format that could be more accessible given the circumstances? So there's a lot of flexibility in this plan. To break all of this down another way, and I have to confess, this is a little idiosyncratic when you think about it like this, because a lot of these categories overlap. But I kind of like to think about projects using these general frameworks. So thinking about data visualization, thinking about audio video, thinking about mapping, thinking about exhibits, and then a kind of catch-all category for things that don't really fit in those. So like I said, it's a little idiosyncratic, but this is where we'll go through a number of tools and look at some example projects as well. And I'll go through this rather quickly because, again, I think it's very helpful if you have the slides and you click through these in your own time. But it's almost unfair to think of data visualization as a project of its own type, because a lot of times data visualizations get embedded into other bigger digital projects. But here you could think of something as kind of low tech, as just building tables and graphs in a spreadsheet program like LibreOffice. Or you can go to the other end of that spectrum and look into a tool like Gephi for network analysis, or Tableau for other types of data visualizations. A lot of these tools too are useful for testing proofs of concept. So Voyant, which is a simple text analysis browser-based program, it's not the most robust of platforms, but it can help you see patterns that you might not otherwise see and target the types of work you might want to do down the line. So again, take these slides, click through these, and explore these platforms a little more closely on your own time. Because that'll I think provide a lot of the inspiration that you might be wanting. Audio visual might seem a little more clear to us, right? We think of video series, we think of podcasts. Here I throw up just two platforms that I like to use with my students. WeVideo, it is not open access, but there is a free level that at least allows you to test it out. Audacity is totally open access and open source. So that's a tool that you can try out for audio editing as well. Podcasts seem to be the hot thing right now, right? Everyone's creating a podcast, and some people think that a podcast really is just sitting there with your phone and recording yourself talking about a thing, but there's a lot more skill that goes into it. Thinking through, again, the audience, thinking through this, writing the script, thinking through the different artistic flourishes you might want to include, like various transition musics, or even thinking through the artistry that goes into the cover design once you share this. Peopling the Past is a great example of a number of different digital initiatives, but this was another initiative that was born out of the pandemic, and that kind of panic that many of us faced when we had to quickly transition to online teaching and learning, right? They just wanted to create a platform for folks to learn about the past and also learn about the people studying the past, which is their mission. The Thin End of the Wedge is an example of a really great podcast from your neck of the woods by John Taylor from the British Museum, where he tells stories about life in the ancient Middle East and about the people that lived there, their communities, and kind of the gritty reality of their lives. And I had a really interesting experience this summer when I was working with elementary and middle school faculty and some high school faculty, and I assigned them some podcasts to listen to specifically about Pompeii. And it was really interesting to hear them think about what they liked and what they didn't like from those podcasts. Because one of my favorite podcasts, it's called Stuff You Should Know by the How Stuff Works Network. And it's just two guys talking about topics, a whole variety of topics. And I remember the teachers that I was working with said that they really didn't like that one because there was too much like banter between the two guys, right? It wasn't academic enough, basically. And I was like, wow, I've been listening to this for so long. I didn't even think to warn you guys that might be the case, right? It's so there's a certain art to this type of work and figuring out how to craft it for a specific audience. Same with video production. And so I highlight here just Digital Hammurabi. Again, they do a variety of different types of output. Digital Hammurabi considers itself a digital humanities and public outreach project that aims to provide reliable, accurate information about the ancient Near East in an entertaining and engaging fashion. And they're really active on social media as well. So when we get back to that conversation about trying to really put the pseudo-archaeologists in their place, I think the Digital Hammurabi team is doing a good job in that regard. Mapping projects are also very popular because a lot of what we're talking about has a spatial element. So StoryMap.js is a product by the Night Lab team, which is actually a journalism initiative at Northwestern University that is pretty simple to use. And products like Esri's ArcGIS and Story Maps are also platforms, but again, that do end up costing a premium. But that's one of those things where, if you have a mapping project in mind, maybe you draft it in StoryMap.js, the free and open access platform. And if it's good, and if you want to pursue it some more, you use that as a prototype to apply for funding, right? So that you can actually get the Esri access, so you can do something a little more robust in the future. And here I highlight a project by a colleague of ours, Matt Howland, called The Kingdom of Copper. Here it's a story of Fainan in the southern Levant and the role that copper played in the development of the region in the Iron Age. So he's got interactive maps and engaging interface. And this is the kind of project that really isn't possible through traditional print media, right? This is something that is multimodal. It's not just taking a PDF and putting it on your screen for a different kind of experience. The whole experience is quite different. When it comes to exhibitions or digital publications, oftentimes we're talking about content management systems. So digital platforms that can manage a whole bunch of digital files. And I'm almost done with all of this because I know we're running out of time. So we'll get to the discussion soon. But here are just a few platforms. I've used Instagram with my students. A lot of us are familiar with that platform just for social purposes, right? But thinking of how we can use that pedagogically, I think is a really interesting exercise. And it's been really fun to do that over the last couple of years with my students. Again, a couple examples here: Constructing the Sacred, built up in Scalar. This is by Elaine Sullivan, and like Kingdom of Copper, this is largely map oriented, but it is a formal publication through the Stanford University Press. And as such, it also won the AIA's Outstanding Work in Digital Archaeology Award last year, which is really exciting, right? You have a born digital publication that is being recognized by an established university press that is winning a book award, right? That is winning an award for being such great work. So I love that we're finally seeing the fruits of our labors in digital technologies having an impact. Another great project is by my new institution, the excavation of Antioch on the Orontes from the Princeton University Visual Resources collections. And Omeka, again, another one of these content management systems that allows you to build digital exhibitions that are full of robust metadata. And you know, these are the kinds of projects that are great complements to actual exhibitions. But in light of the fact that we've all been, for the past couple of years, learning how to deal without access to libraries, learning how to deal without access to museums, these are the types of projects that have been really fun to see develop. And then finally, just this kind of catch-all category, I throw up here one of the types of digital projects that I don't think fits this mold, or these molds that we've been talking about. This is the Digital Data Stories project by Open Context, and this is run by two of my colleagues there. Data stories they've conceived of as kind of these open access articles backed by deeper layers of open and reproducible analytical and visual code, as well as primary research data. And this approach aims at linking and opening doors to multiple levels of engagement with the primary data, with narrative elements and content learning on top of that. Another thing that doesn't really fit this mold is what I would call data journalism, right? So a lot of us may be familiar with the site 538, where they turn numbers into something that is fascinating to watch and so exciting to look at. And unfortunately, I think for the Americans in the group, a lot of this comes to the fore during election season, where I'm looking at 538 and I'm just refreshing and waiting for them to update me on where various results are going. But they do some fun stuff too. So is this a model that you could use for your own work to show off some aspect of your research? Crowdsourced projects, I think, are really fascinating, and we'll talk more about Infinite Armenias in just a second. But you know, a type of project where you get community input, right, where you get feedback from a variety of stakeholders. This happens to be my colleague Tiffany's project. So during the question period, if there's anything specific about crowdsourcing projects or Infinite Armenias, I'm sure she'd be happy to flag those questions. But I love this idea of getting more and more people involved and vested in this kind of work. And then finally, what about something totally experimental? So here I throw up one of my favorite. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure called Redshift and Portal Mental, where your planet is dying. It's this dystopian walk through a future that, you know, is getting closer and closer to reality that we're in. But unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, here you have a chance to really make some headway and influence outcomes. And it's just a fun sort of experience to think about applying to the kinds of scholarship that we do, right? How can we maybe turn our work into something like a choose your own adventure or some kind of map where people get to choose their path? Where do we go from here, right? What are you thinking when you're confronted with all of these things, and how can this help you get started? So I think that one of the best things you can do for yourself is review digital projects, right? So take this slide deck as a starting point and go through these projects in more depth and figure out what you like and what you don't like, and use that sort of gut reaction to inform how you might want to start your own digital storytelling project, and have some reasons too. You know, it could be as simple as you don't like the navigation, or you don't like the formatting of something. That's fine. But looking at a number of examples is really one of the best ways to figure out what you like and then what you think is possible. Along the what you think is possible line, set up interviews, right? One thing that we've all probably learned is that academics love talking about themselves and they love talking about their work. So, you know, get used to cold emailing people and seeing if they'd like to come in and talk about the work that they've done, and really pick their brains about what it took to get a project up and running, and get a project funded, and get a project, you know, on the longevity spectrum that you all are thinking of. Again, people love talking about themselves. So you know, 9 times out of 10, they will write back to you and set that Zoom conversation up, because now we can all do this on Zoom too. So it gets much easier. So what are you thinking? Again, hopefully this is giving you some inspiration for what kind of storytelling project you might want to be developing. And again, those kind of idiosyncratic categories down at the bottom in the blue, you know, use those as anchors and think of ways that you can recombine them. Think of ways that you could pick out elements that you find attractive from each category, or think of building these kind of stacked projects where maybe the first year you're working on a podcast, the next year you're working on video tutorials, right? And think about how that all fits together in your plan. And I think the path towards working on and completing a digital storytelling project can in fact be understood using an example from Tiffany, and using, this is 100% her metaphor of the hero's journey, right? So the idea that you are a hero and your digital project is the outcome in this conception. So I'll talk just for a few minutes about Infinite Armenias. In the summer of 2018, and again, Tiffany, jump in if I'm getting your words wrong, but in the summer of 2018, Tiffany and her colleagues ran a story center style digital storytelling workshop in Armenia, and this was on the topic of disappearing cultural heritage. Tiffany, you look like you're going to say something.
No, I was listening.
Okay.
Yeah,
no problem. And in that workshop, they provided digital support and storytelling advice, and a group of students from her institution, the University of Central Florida, and a group of cultural heritage professionals and activists, they set to work making stories based on the themes that they've been discussing. And her collaborative crowdsourced digital storytelling project, Infinite Armenias, was born out of this work, was born out of this initiative. So how did she go from that kernel of a very important idea to this fully developed, and in fact still developing, digital project that is so excellent and such a wonderful sort of project to explore? So again, I think we can think about this as a real hero's journey here. So Tiffany's call to adventure, if you asked her about this, was really the funding call, right? So she may never have really completed this project if ARIS hadn't offered collaborative heritage management grants for Armenian work. And she knew that she wanted to do something public, and she knew that she wanted to do something community-based, but this really gave her the space and the motivation to plan out what was going to be feasible. So reading calls for funding and keeping an eye out for where the dollars are is a really good way to spark your creativity, right? We are nothing if not a commercially driven society. Ultimately, there are challenges and temptations, right? And when you're working on any kind of digital project, you are going to encounter difficulties. And so there are promising techniques that don't necessarily work, or your hard drive crashes at a very critical moment, or there's good advice from a helper who pops up mid-journey that you wish you had taken, right? For Tiffany and her colleagues, everything kind of magically lined up. I'm sure there were lots of hurdles that she had to overcome, but that lineup, that sort of idea that things are going to work out, those results are not necessarily typical. And so you have to really be patient with yourself and the process that you're embarking on when you pursue any kind of digital project. And I think this is true in the digital humanities more generally. We're really comfortable talking about failure and talking about false starts in a way that in some other academic areas, that's not really appreciated, right? But I feel like in digital humanities more generally, that is welcome, that's appreciated. And then finally, the triumphant return. So in the end, like Gilgamesh, like Frodo, like Heracles, like Skywalker, we all come back from the depths, often guided by a goddess who sees the real value of and the potential for your project. Maybe that's a project manager, maybe that's a librarian, maybe that's a funding body. And then mortal, or I guess hobbit, I guess, and changed, but you have this renewed sense of purpose in what you're doing, right? And hopefully by the end, you've got this nice digital project to show for it as well and to share. I'm sorry that went a little longer than expected, but hopefully that gave us a lot of food for thought. Hopefully, I know I can stay a little later if people do want to keep the conversation going. But thank you all for inviting Tiffany and I to present today. And yeah, excited to see where the conversation goes.
This was so wonderful, and I already have so many questions. In case if we have questions from the audience, then just feel free to unmute yourself. And yeah.
And I gotta say, Tiffany, thank you so much for giving me the freedom to speak about your stuff. the way, for those of you who might have come in late, with Tiffany's internet being uncertain in the storm zone right now, we thought this would be easier, and that meant that I had big shoes to fill as I'm speaking about infinite Armenias while she's she's right there.
No, thank you for taking on this somewhat bigger responsibility last minute. Having a plan that you were going to do the presentation just seemed less fraught than, you know, gambling on my internet access. So
yes.
Thanks for taking that on. And I am happy to answer any questions that any of you have about digital projects more generally. I know that in the past, when we have done these sorts of workshops, a lot of people who come to them are people who have ideas for a digital project that they would like to start, but don't know how to get started. So if anyone would like to talk about their idea, or ideas for platforming, or ideas for dissemination, you know, we'd be more than happy to talk about that.
Michelle, I can call on people, or.
Yeah, so I just had a question about audiences. So one of the things you mentioned, which I completely agree with, is there's no such thing as a general audience. And so I was wondering if you have any sort of tips or advice to share about how you go about identifying who your audience actually is.
Yeah, well, I think there's, and again, Tiffany, jump in, but I think there's kind of two ways to answer that question. So first, when you're planning something, right, you've got to pick a group that you're interested in, right? So, you know, for me and my work in the Mediterranean, one thing that I'm trying to do is work with the local community in the small town of Cabras to share stories about the work we're doing at the archaeological site that overlaps a little bit with the work that they're interested in at the winery in town. So there's a fun overlap there. But, you know, for me, that is sort of motivated by my own personal interest, by what I see as a need in that community, and a place where my work can sort of help fill that gap. But on the other end, right, say you've built a thing, one thing that you can do is test it, right? And get feedback from people that are visiting the project, people that are accessing these resources, right? And some of that can be very pointed, right? Like you can have a call for beta testers for whatever project you've built, or some of it can be passive. You can leave a poll on the site and encourage users to do that work. I feel like the more pointed call to action is normally the better route, but it all kind of depends on what you want out of that. Tiffany, what did you have to add to that?
I would say the more specific that you can be about your intended audience in the development phase of your project, the better. I am strangely relatively frequently called upon to evaluate grant proposals for digital projects. And I would say one area that is neglected in a lot of these proposals is a clear definition of audience. Sometimes you'll hear someone define their audience as a general audience, including K through 12 and adults and, you know, anyone. And obviously the needs of you know, these age ranges are very different. And so I think having a more focused project, you'll serve the needs of your intended audience better if you have a focus to your audience than if you try to, you know, catch everyone with your project. So understanding who your audience is and developing content that is focused towards their needs, I think is a good, you know, part of the planning process of a digital project.
Thanks.
I have a question. So my question is within the context of digital exhibitions. And so back in, I think, 2016, when UK decided to remake the Palmyra Arch of Triumph, the monument that was destroyed by the ISIS, this motive was really criticized, like this act of remaking that heritage and also making it available on the screens of your phones and your tablets, iPads. It was criticized by the local historians, and they cited some of the reasons being that in this process of the digital remaking or digital exhibition of their heritage, the locals, they tend to lose their side of the story. And does it really help in reconciliation, and what, or maybe does it have more repercussions for the communities who are already, you know, suffering due to the conflict? So that is one question I'm like really interested to explore, and I would like to have your insight on this.
Yeah. So there are other workshops that Tiffany and I have led where we've delved a little more into the ethics of this entire topic, because I think that's exactly what you're hitting in your comment, Sabine. And there has been a lot of good work done in that area. I think for me, part of it boils down to transparency and just like general good faith actions, right? And I think, you know, especially when you're dealing with marginalized populations, especially when you're dealing with Indigenous communities, when you are an outsider coming in, that's work that you really need to prioritize to make sure that those relationships are well developed and are secure, and that everyone feels safe in that environment. And I don't know why I'm actually talking about this at all, because Tiffany, that's the whole point of Infinite Armenias, right? Like, do you, I don't know if you have some things to say there.
Right. So one of the problems that a practice like digital storytelling aims to solve is the sort of dynamic that is set up when, let's call them researchers, go into a place and do something like oral history projects, where, you know, they are guiding the questions and the interrogation of, you know, local people in the places where, you know, they're researching or working. Instead, a storytelling practice is meant to allow people to engage with the topics in their own words and on their own terms, to guide the narrative of that story, providing, you know, digital tools as well as, you know, some sort of place to discuss storytelling. But even in that context, not, you know, directing the nature of the narrative, understanding that can be very sort of culturally focused, how narratives work. So that is the need that sort of practice aims to address. I do think it's important when, you know, I'm an archaeologist and I work in the area of digital heritage. It's important to assess needs when you're working in a place. Sometimes you want to help and you identify a need, but it you know, when this process becomes divorced from the needs and interests of stakeholders in those local communities, I think that's when you can see this sort of backlash, is that there's just basically a lack of conversation. I have to assume that the researchers who, you know, made these digital heritage projects, you know, on some level, it was a desire to do good drove them, you know, to reconstruct what was destroyed and their own trauma and their own sadness of this, but in the process lost, you know, the sort of thread of communication, which is really important in these community-based projects.
Yeah, Cornelia.
Hello, everyone. Sorry for not turning on the camera, but it doesn't work for some reason.
No, don't apologize.
Thank you very much for this very fascinating lecture and for making it public, because I think in many places in the world and institutions, we are still light years away from talking about these kind of subjects. So I'm very, very grateful. I wanted to ask, I have a question about funding. So, because this is actually where everything goes down to, because this enables us to finance our projects. So, apart from research grants or grants that are well connected to heritage, do you think it's wise to look for well, let's say non-academic, academic funding resources like companies and something like that? And would it undermine the seriousness of the project if these kinds of funding sources are showcased at those projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. Tiffany, what are your...
Well, I personally have no experience with going the more, let's call it, development route, where you attempt to raise money for these initiatives by approaching, you know, a public or private sector, you know, for funding. All of my work has been funded through academic program funding. I would think the only thing that I can sort of think of at this point to think through is, you know, the ethics or conflict of interest that may exist in certain partnerships. I know that a lot of people were really critical, for example, of the, you know, British Museum accepting, you know, BP sponsorship for the Ashurbanipal exhibit, and there were, you know, demonstrations against this partnership. So I think it is important to think of, you know, think through, you know, the right partners. That's really the only advice that I have along those lines.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add to that, with the caveat that you do that, right, that you think through that and sort of understand the relationships that you're getting into, I don't think it would necessarily undermine the message or undermine the work, right? I think that everyone knows this kind of work is expensive, and I think that's why when Tiffany and I are working with students, we really value the idea of a proof of concept, right? And you know, you build up something small to see how it's going to land, and to see if you do have an audience, to see if it does what you want. That way you're not sinking all of the money into something that's going to flop. People know these big scale projects do take time, and they do take a lot of funding. So if you're resourceful and can find that, and can obviously think through the ramifications of what those connections mean and those relationships mean, I don't think anyone would fault you for that.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I'm sure some people would fault you for that, but you know, most of the academics will not, right? Most of the people you want on your side will not.
Yeah, well, my question came also from the fact that, as we all know, I mean, I'm from the Eastern European context, so research fundings are very, very small. So it's sometimes impossible to fund the project, and because there's also other people involved in these kind of projects, to give them a reasonable salary, because in the end, I mean, it's in academia, we don't talk about salaries very easily, but that's the thing. So in order to finance these great projects, I think maybe this is also a good idea to find reasonable partners outside academia. Thank you.
Yeah. And especially, I think there's an avenue in there for government heritage organizations too. I think that, you know, there are pockets of money in historic preservation offices, and again, it's you know your sort of cultural context better than anyone else, so you would know what the possibilities for that are. But I've had a lot of really interesting conversations, at least from the American side of things, talking through those possible partnerships over the past couple of years. Other thoughts or questions?
I would love to have some few comments and maybe question as well. And so first of all, thank you so much. There are a lot of things to think in. And about the region which you mentioned, like to have the focus your audience, the region which you are working on. I think the reason about this, the creating the Caucasus Through Time Network group of master and PhD student, pandemic kind of trigger to create this network. And also I think the biggest reason is kind of still this region underrepresented and under kind of there are a lot of challenges, and especially we are focusing on the early career researchers and open access to sources. So yeah, I think to know your audience, and also being most of our committee member being from the Caucasus region, we know the kind of, it's kind of a bridge between Western institutions and the Caucasus itself, which is great. And also, or maybe I can go forward, and or maybe Saba, because Saba, we have, it's kind of overlapping with today's workshop. We won the small grant from London Art Humanity Partnership to run competition, image of research competition. So we will be open the call for submissions soon. If you want, Saba, say a few words about that competition. So Saba is leading the project.
So we are planning to launch this competition in the upcoming few days, and the intent really is to empower early career researchers and also undergraduate students and even the industrialists who are working on Caucasus in the field of arts and humanities, including obviously archaeology, ethnography, linguistics, and other art-related fields. So yeah, stay tuned to our Twitter handle, and yeah, we'll be able to give you the update on that. And we'll be really obliged if your students and if our audience can participate in that. And we also have cash prize available because we got the funding from the London Arts and Humanities Partnership. So yeah.
So yes, it's very much exciting. And also I would love to have a very quick question. I don't know, maybe it is comment or question, but Tiffany, to you, maybe you can. So you're working on very much in the Caucasus, and I've read recently an article from Dr. Elena Rova, and it's about the chronology, but the one sentence which really draw my attention, integrating highland societies and lowland societies. So for example, lowland societies, when we talk about Near Eastern, Mesopotamia and Iran, and the highland societies, Caucasus. So what she put as in the sentence kind of like lowland societies is very much the largest settlement size, temple architecture, you know, as an indicator of the central power, but the lowland is kind of primitive societies. So I had this question, like, when you put in digital storytelling, this narrative, what is the difference between this, the very much complex societies, and the, let's say, from the case studies from the Caucasus, is there any difficulties when you have this, the creating this narrative. And yeah, I don't know whether it makes sense, the question.
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think there is a certain overlap of like ancient stories and modern stories to disentangle.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the arguments that James C. Scott makes about, you know, these marked differences between highland and lowland societies is that a lot of trappings of modernization have done a lot to eliminate these different trajectories. And I think what Elena was talking about was in the ancient past, the mm-hmm. difference between these highland trajectories and these lowland trajectories. And an example of this that I see in my own research on the ancient highland empire of Urartu is that people always want to talk about the Urartian Empire in terms of urbanism and in terms of fortress cities. Mm-hmm. But this isn't a correct way to talk about Urartu and how it was organized, because it wasn't organized around the logic of these large lowland grain staple empires, you know, well known from Mesopotamia. So you have different sort of cultural trajectories, but they're not isolated. There is a lot of exchange and hybridity and a movement along these borders. And so we need to appreciate the ways in which people were both influenced by, but also influenced one another, and not see it as this top-down narrative in which the grand civilizations of, you know, Iraq and Syria, you know, had this one-way relationship with the highland peoples who, you know, lived in these mountainous borders. So I think that's an important, you know, sort of anthropological corrective to weave into our narratives. And I'm glad that Elena wrote this article, which I haven't yet had a chance to read, but it sounds very interesting, and thank you for bringing it to my attention.
Yeah, it's about like, so it's called How Wide is the Nearest? Some reflection on the limits of Near Eastern archaeology. Mm-hmm. So yes, this is very much interesting when we are putting the Caucasus narrative. And I liked when you say like it is very much integrated, they are not separated, very much they influence to each other. Thank you so much.
I think like we can now wrap up this session. And I'm really thankful to Dr. Tiffany. Like, thank you so much for joining this session, because I was like, the situation is not really good in Florida. And I read this news update in the morning and I was so worried. But I'm happy that you managed to like join us. And thank you so much, Dr. Leigh. And I'm happy to see that, you know, your background is all like sorted and things are not that messed up. And I was like so worried. Oh my God. And thank you, Dr. Leigh, for walking us through this workshop session. And it was really engaging, and there's so much to, you know, absorb and to learn from. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I said at the beginning, I think Tiffany and I are just we're grateful that you guys reached out. And so you've got our contact info, so feel free to be in touch if other questions come up, or Tiffany said, if people want to throw ideas into the air and see what sticks. We love having those conversations.
Thank you so much.
And also, I would just like to mention here that the LAHP funding that we have got, it was tied with Gwen's PhD funding. So yeah, we're really thankful to her as well for, you know, getting that grant for the competition. Yeah.
I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Caucasus Through Time Network for inviting us to be here today, and to congratulate you on all you've done to build this this community and this group of scholars. I think it is so important, and it is a valuable service that you are providing to early career researchers as well as scholars more generally. So thank you for investing your valuable time in, you know, developing digital scholarship, developing research in the Caucasus. It's a wonderful thing that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good day, everyone, or a good night, I guess, for most of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.